Hey, so welcome to the Athos Diet Podcast. We have a phenomenal speaker and person to interview today, Dr. Timothy Patitsas, who has been on the Athos Diet Podcast before. To kind of bring the audience up to speed from our last conversation. Last time when we talked, and actually I just listened to our chat just yesterday, it was about an hour. It occurred like 2 years ago. Ukraine had just been invaded by Russia. It is still being invaded by Russia. We were talking about the nature of moral injury, about the dynamic of war, its cost, the idea that no matter how well you can intellectualize it, there's always a spiritual injury that occurs. And much of what the Ethics of Beauty in the first chapter tries to discuss and restore is how we can bring these oftentimes broken individuals, if not just injured individuals, back into liturgy. And we also ended on, I think, a high note, which was the importance of camaraderie as an antidote to individuals going berserk. And this berserk state being one, it's almost like a divine rage, a feeling of nihilism, a thirst for justice, but at the same time in the hands of human beings, so that justice is never really served out correctly, and we can kind of see what happens in that state. I have to say, it's very rare in my mind, at least the stories or the people that I know, that when they try to strike that justice, that they do it in the right balance. It seems desperate, it seems chaotic, and ultimately it seems unjust, no matter their intentions. And then we also discussed about this idea of the timeline to grieve, and how historically that digesting and that reflecting was a more ritualized aspect of grieving. And we compared a lot of these things to experiences I've had in the emergency department or with particular patients. And I highlighted in particular the unfortunate state of things where we take care of one patient who nearly died, or maybe we saved them, and there's no time to celebrate, there's no time to grieve, there's no time to digest, on to the next thing. And so in some ways, it's a very honest well of work, but at the same time, it can really burn you out. So that's kind of where we came from. I wanted to set the stage for today's discussion with a few statistics, if that's all right. So the national U.S. debt as of September of 2024 was 35.3 trillion. 35.3 trillion. And we literally now are spending over $1 trillion a year just in interest payments serving that debt. I believe countries like China and Japan have large portions of the debt we owe them. And interestingly, in 2023, to let people know that this is not a balanced equation, we only brought in $4.4 trillion in tax revenue in 2023. Nevertheless, we now need over $1 trillion just to service our debt. And the biggest line items that we're spending money on are national defense, Medicare, and Social Security. So I wanted to ask you this, Uncle Tim, Dr. Tim, Professor Patitsas, how does this discussion of war and how we identify individuals going berserk, how does that scale up at a national scale? And how does that scope change fundamentally the topic? In my mind, it seems as we recruit armies and nation states fight and nation states go berserk, as we could talk about, Israel and Palestine. This seems to me like a recipe for a lot of problems. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenon throughout human history where one side will provoke the other to great feats of vengeance, and people do have this kind of demonic madness that will take over a nation, and everyone kind of feels justified in the moment in doing it. But you do want a professional military for people to, precisely because they will have studied things like just war theory and have some kind of arm's length, as they say, perspective on how not to go too far. I mean, you don't want to. I mean, it's certainly a complex topic, but you think about the great economist from England, John Maynard Keynes, was a delegate for Great Britain to Versailles at the close of World War One, and he's the only person that I've heard of that resigned his position on the delegation. He returned to England early because he was convinced that the punitive conditions being imposed on Germany would only and quickly bring a second war.
Interesting.
So and we have this, this use ad bellum, this use in bello, the law of how to go, it's justified to go to war, the law of how to conduct yourself in war. And now there's a use post bellum, especially in the light of Versailles, that says what is moral and consistent with international law and morality in terms of concluding a just peace, so you don't just keep going through these cycles.
Have you heard these statistics? And I've heard a lot of this being debated on Piers Morgan, Uncensored, and others. But people who, let's say, are pro-Israel will brag almost to the extent of how few civilian casualties there have been relative to historic ratios. I mean, I didn't even know that such ratios existed. But I guess there are people in the scene, behind the scenes, who are kind of saying, "Hey, was this collateral damage more streamlined than before?" And many of them are stating, although it doesn't feel right, but I guess it must intellectually be correct, that the collateral damage or the civilian casualties, although they number of 45,000 now, something like that in Gaza, that per militant, it's actually not a bad ratio. And I have to think to myself, where we said that I think there were 1 million casualties in Iraq. I don't know how many of those represented soldiers that we killed as Americans, but we only lost 4,600 people in the Iraqi wars. So how would you compare this feeling, this analysis intellectually with what we're kind of feeling is still maybe not the right ratio? Am I off? Is my gut that something's still wrong a problem? Is that where the intellect should take over and we should celebrate the fact that numerically things are okay? Or am I missing something?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought this through all the way. I mean, there's a sense, you don't want people or nations to berserk. And according to Jonathan Shea in Achilles in Vietnam, the individual who berserks normally does not survive. They may survive that battle and others, but they normally do not escape the battle, the war entirely. And similarly with a nation that, really just lets it all hang loose, it's really sowing the seeds for its own future destruction. And you can see something like that in the United States, that we did such a thorough job of annihilating and firebombing the cities of Japan in the closing days of the war, and even before we dropped the atomic bombs. And how could that be completely unrelated to the fact that we came home and almost at once set about annihilating our own cities, not through bombing, but through urban planning and just the complete. And maybe it was partly just a sense that cities are not safe, get highways in there so they can be rapidly evacuated, disperse people because a nuclear war could come. Who knows? Somehow, though, there was some kind of a connection. And Eisenhower thought we should not have dropped the bombs, that it was not necessary, and that it was a terrible thing. But Eisenhower did threaten to use the bomb early in 1953, when the Korean War was dragging on and both sides were kind of intransigent, about a peace. And that was tough. We made a big deal of the fact that many Chinese soldiers didn't want to return to a communist country. And that was a big sticking point for them, to get as many of their POWs back as possible. And then they, in the event, they kept many of our POWs who never returned, and in revenge for that. So, of course, the ones who stayed on our side, went on to Taiwan and had wives and children and just lived a normal life, whereas our guys were consigned to Siberia or something, to camps. But Yeah, so you're always you don't want to fight a war in cold blood, right? Because then you'd always be fighting, and it would be just like you were taking out the trash or something. Like there has to be that themos, there has to be that engagement of the body and the bodily reaction and the emotions. But by the same token, you cannot let that take over completely.
I remember there was a discussion that lately on a podcast, they were reflecting on the idea that a Christian nation is the only nation that should have gun rights and free speech. In that those two rights are so imperative and, well, such a huge responsibility that only if you had the framework of Christianity with its understanding of justice, mercy, forgiveness, that you could allow individuals to have such privileges. And I just wonder to what extent you would say that us engaging in war as a Christian nation, that we did ultimately drop the bombs, and we've threatened to use them again, but we haven't. To what extent do you believe that technology and that scale of power with the wrong philosophy could result in a nation state going berserk and using those weapons to complete destruction? Is it? I mean, I don't know all the countries that have nuclear weapons at this point. I think it's quite a few. But to what extent, do you think that we're only protected from abuse of this technology by a Christian ethos or a Christian paradigm, where we finally can return back to center and say, okay, no matter our justifications, intellectual justification, we just can't do X, Y, and Z because of what we believe and who we are?
I mean, by now, almost every nation on earth has, some Christian population, has some exposure to, what is kind of fundamental for civilization from the gospel. So I think, I don't know about, that podcast assertion, but certainly the ancients thought that civilization was both a gift and a miracle. And I think it's certainly, what I tell my students who are future priests is that, I'm not speaking authoritatively, but I think just as their social ethics professor, they would be better off not voting and as clergy, as ordained clergy, and instead the night before an election day, have a vigil liturgy at the parish and pray for the peace of heart of the voters, the clarity of the voters, maybe if it's anger that, the voters should be feeling, just that it be a blessed, be angry, but do not sin, as St. Paul said. So I think that, I do think that religion as an idea, religion as a concept, but also, Christ himself and God and our Savior and the Holy Spirit and the angels, we're always invoking them to protect us.
You do sometimes wonder, I mean, there's these moments in the Iliad and the Odyssey where these supernatural beings come down and they vivify the soldiers, or they inspire an individual. And I almost wonder to some extent, because we talk about this herd mentality and how outcomes can sometimes be unpredictable, or suddenly something occurs you wouldn't have expected. You almost just wonder what's sort of influencing these outcomes sometimes. I mean, just given the old stories, and how that prayer makes a difference. Sort of related, but maybe slightly different. At least it reminds me of this. This idea of prayer as almost lifeless. Like some would say, in the most caustic argument, what, I thank you for your prayers, but I'd rather you give me bread to eat. And even in the Gospels, in the what is it, of James, I believe, the epistles, he essentially says, hey, what, if someone is hungry and you say, hey, I'll say a prayer for you, and you don't give them bread, it's kind of an empty promise. But as I've explored fasting and what seemingly seems to be such a empty pastime, you might say, the reality is that underneath that perspective, with that discipline, there is, in fact, physiologically a return on investment that God has engineered into the world. I guess what I'm wondering is, could you take that same sort of rationale and figure out a butterfly effect for prayer? You know, when the priest does come back to center and lead his parishioners through this prayer service and clear their minds, etc., does it do something, you know, that we just can't track as easily? And how does that manifest?
Well, you know, if you were studying the human race, you know, with the same objectivity that we study the animal kingdom or even the plant kingdom, you know, you would say a behavior or you know, a response in the case of animals, you know, things lower than animals. But let's stick with animals. A behavior in the animal kingdom that a species exhibits everywhere must have some selectivity for survival.
Uh-huh.
And all the human race is always religious. It's never not been religious. And you know, so that speaks to the idea that somehow this is an adaptive behavior. I mean, it's just objectively the case that, and you can see, you know, what is the impact of, you know, for my mentor, Jane Jacobs, you know, the first impact is that it helps society to survive because religion and culture, but especially, you know, art, but especially, you know, religion has this capacity to reconcile the two broad social ethical syndromes that you need for a society. So she said, societies are dynamically unstable because they need to defend themselves and they also need to produce. And the cultural mindset and the morality that supports each are at odds. And it's what you call a third force that keeps them in some kind of equipoise. So that's the obvious first thing. But you know, there's a million ways that you can show that, you know, liturgy converts chaos to cosmos. That'd be a high level say it. A computer way to say it is that liturgy is the analog to digital converter of the human race. It takes analog and confused states and gives them simple digital outcomes so that we can build a stable world around them. For example, your love for your wife, you know, it exists on an analog spectrum from extremely tense to maybe you're sick of each other and everywhere. But the marriage ritual produces a clear, publicly conveyable digital state. Either you're married or you're not. And absent that ritual, your relationship is meaningless to yourselves and the world because no one knows, are we supposed to be supporting this couple when they fight or preying on them when they fight? Are we supposed to, you know, if
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's a great point. It because you could rationally break down any moment in a couple's dialogue, specifically argument, and be like, oh well, that's just not going to work, or that's tyrannical, and that slave should walk away as fast as possible from that thing. But at the same time, if you do recognize that as a permanent state, as a value and virtue that needs to be worked through, solved, you know, supported, you know, that really does change the game. I mean, I can totally see how in my generation, I'm a millennial, you know, there seem to be two rounds of life events for people who I knew from high school. There seemed to be a group that had a lot of children out of wedlock. And then there seemed to be another group of people who got married later on and then just quickly got divorced on a very large scale. Like it wasn't just, oh, this was a random, you know, unfortunate case, but was really a trend.
Those are two major cohorts.
Yeah, seemingly.
Before we go into that, you know, just in terms of war, it's another, there's a ritual for declaring war. And the United States, out of fear or something, decided to forego that ritual in 1950 and again in 1965 or 64, whenever you date, you know, the beginning of large scale ground combat operations in Vietnam. Likewise, in the Iraq War, we haven't declared war since 1940, December of 1941.
Really?
And have any of those wars been coherent? Have any of them produced cosmos? Have any of them produced what we can call a victory? Have any of them produced, and how does that impact the person with trauma that you're going to get? some percentage of soldiers are going to take away from a war, when the whole structure of the war is in a wildly varying analog state. I mean,
Uh-huh.
we
Right.
were
So if
fighting
it's on or
against the
off.
Taliban for 20 years.
Yeah.
Suddenly, it was over. Everything collapsed in moments.
Yeah.
And the next day, we were shipping hundreds of millions of dollars of aid to the Taliban. Like, how is the mind supposed to justify the sacrifice of life and limb and friend in that, against that backdrop?
That would be so incredibly confusing. Bringing it back to the ER, it would almost be as if I never had a shift that was supposed to officially start. They might have told me to show up to the hospital. I wouldn't have known to put on my uniform. I didn't have my stethoscope. A patient shows up. Is this a simulation? Is this a test? And at the same time, is this real? And in fact, it's kind of funny because you do have to put on a certain uniform. Like it's almost like you're flipping a switch when you go into this role. And I will say, just on a daily basis, that's very important. Just the ritual. Like I drive 90 minutes now to get to one of my community ERs, and I have a particular sequence of things I do. I wake up at a certain time. I stop at a certain gas station. I get a certain thing of caffeine.
Sure.
I talk to the lady there. I have my stethoscope. When I leave my car, I put on my badge. I put my pencil here, my pen. I put the stethoscope on, and before I enter the ER, I'm like locked and ready to go. But if even, if that ceremony didn't exist, it'd be quite confusing for me to kind of turn on and get into the right mental state.
The more directly you confront chaos, the more ritualized your life must be. So serial killers, right? They have their ritual, but so do saints, right? Because they're one is trying to become possessed by the chaos. The other is trying to conquer it in the service of life.
Wow.
Pilots, all sorts of people who are doing things. Now, this also relates to how people dress, because people used to kind of dress as part of the ritual of going off to work and turning chaos into order. They had faith in that possibility. Now, people do not dress for success; they dress for survival, because there's a general sense. It's not quite that everyone's traumatized, but it is the sense that there has been, the patriarchy has crumbled, the social order has crumbled, and people are kind of thrown back on their individual survival. That's why everyone's so casual in how they dress and how they conduct themselves.
I'll tell you,
they don't have hope in the possibility of cosmos.
Yeah, beautifully said. The more chaos, the more ritual we need for the antidote for it. I know that
right. So if you were going to go into the ED, the emergency department, and just fool around and didn't really care about outcomes, you could come in any old way.
Yeah.
But if you're heading there from the moment you wake up, going, this is life or death, and I am not going to lose. I am going to save every possible patient, do every possible thing. I'm going to kick butt. Then you are going to lock down. Now, some people, have such high adrenaline in us that the moment they know it's on, it's almost like no further steps can be taken. Like I've seen people like this who, will enter, situations of profound challenge. There's not time to put on the suit or this or that, because they're completely a wild man caged for this. So that happens too. But that is really the rare thing. Most people are just dressing like slobs because they have gotten used to a world without cosmos, and they don't believe. They've been taught to mock anyone who tries to establish cosmos as well.
Yeah, somehow the phrase "never mistake my kindness for weakness" seems to resonate. Like, I feel like there's almost been like an anti-movement where the kind, professional, intelligent, competent person is almost like the uncool one, but like nothing gets done without those individuals, and somehow we've decoupled respect with a lot of those people who complete those duties. I also think about dating and how oftentimes there's a strange culture right now of people who evidently aren't even being intimate at all. Like there's some, and I mean, never mind the sins of lust. I mean, it sounds to me like a lot of people just aren't even getting that far. But they're the warm up to that, I think, was this kind of like, oh, the nice guy, the professional in the room, the well dressed in the room. I'm not really attracted to that. I don't think the girls could say why that was, but I think it was some type of a movement to look for some person that was dressed down, didn't really have a plan, no particular aim, and that was somehow like cool. And by the way, the guy who said he was going to travel to California and surf for 4 hours a day never really goes there. It was just kind of a speech, like a talking point. Very, somehow it seems related, but I don't think people are kind of dressing and getting into the mentality. Maybe it's because they don't have an aim. Maybe it's because they don't have a hierarchy of value that aims towards the highest good, which is religion, and which can be supported by ritual.
I think there was a sense in the 1950s that the mind and the heart had become untethered, and that people were sort of organization men, and they didn't have some connection with their deep heart. And the beatniks and different hippie movements that arose in the 50s and then the 60s seemed to be recovering the way of the body, the way of the heart. But the integration of mind and heart is not trivial. It's hard to achieve, and just the idea that that everyone thinks now that it's something simple to achieve. Just follow your heart. It is not. And it just like we were saying a moment ago about war, like the balance between a war that is not in cold blood, it's not just some bureaucratic thing, but there's a real reason. There's a real morality at stake in this conflict, but not going to the extreme with that. So you want some balance in the middle there. So.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Again, speaking to this idea of ritual sort of being the antidote to chaos, and the more you're in that sphere, the more you need that ritual. I mean, what does that say then about a society that really does not value ritual? And what does that say about a society who almost looks down on ritual? It's almost like as if they hated the medicine that could cure them. What do they look to replace it with, and how does that have bearing on next steps?
I don't know. I mean, certainly a young man who enters the military, or a young woman, is quickly, they have some desire to achieve something great. Let's say, to harness a kind of animal force, and then they're told, ritualize every aspect of your life. And what, if military training is effective, then they see fairly quickly that the price of accessing that power and that agency is this kind of self-conquest through ritual. And, it stays in balance. You certainly don't want a free spirit, running the nuclear power plant protocols. These people have to be committed to ritual because they realize they are riding a nuclear tiger. And so, and the military is good at that. They don't want someone who's going to get into an SR-71 in the days when we still ran those and fly it and land it in Russia or something. They want to know that these people are locked in and locked down. So, but it's just a question of how far you want to go in life. I mean, if you want to go further, you're going to have to get this balance between wildness and liturgy.
Yeah, that seems to be true in my mind. I mean, there's a sacrifice there. You have to kind of leave Never Land and sort of man up through duty, through responsibility, and in a certain sense that's painful, but at the same time it seems to be so necessary. And at the same time that can give you an incredible sense of trajectory as well. I mean, I know one of the things that my generation struggles with is the overwhelming possibility of all things. I mean, Technology has made the barrier to entry even lower.
Sure.
The cost of things is low. Yeah, you can always go for another major, another degree. There's always another job out there that might pay a little bit more somewhere far away. You can fill in the blanks with idealism and fantasy, and suddenly you're faced with every possibility. It can be quite paralyzing. But at the same time, I think the reality of, or the consequence of that structure has been one of aimlessness, procrastination, and loss of many of the things that are the most basic. I mean, again, I just can't get over the fact that, like, in the good old days, people used to just be accused of the sin of lust, like just sleeping around. Like, evidently that doesn't even happen anymore, not because they're trying to be saintly, but because they're so dead inside.
I mean, there's something, that, because there's been this, the three things have tracked, the rise in obesity, the rise in depression and other forms of mental illness, the rise in, gender dysphoria. Everything is sort of, there's probably something in our food or water, something seems to be happening, but so
Well,
it's hard to say what it is. I mean,
yeah, it is bizarre to me that they say that the average 30-year-old, or that generation of people, has a lower testosterone level than a 50-year-old today, and evidently a lower testosterone level than like a 7-year-old in the 1970s, something strange like that.
I remember those 7-year-olds in the 70s. They were stealing cars and breaking
Right,
beer cans on their heads. Yeah, they
right,
were pretty
right.
tough.
No, but I mean, there is something strange there, and it speaks to this spectrum. Let me ask you what you think about this. This idea of masculinity and femininity, and how you can see the values of those prototypes. Okay, let's just call it that. Where
Yeah,
things
sure.
start fighting, like, oh, we know that this masculinity is good. We know where this femininity is good. But let me give you an example of where I think those things can become toxic in the pursuit of alcoholism, okay? Or
Okay.
trying to get someone cured of it. So you have a parent, mom and dad, they have a son, and the son's an alcoholic. He's been alcoholic for 10, 15 years. I come across these situations all the time in the ER. And it's always very interesting to me that there's kind of two toxic perspectives. One is mom, who in the worst case situation has this sort of toxic compassion. I don't want Johnny to go through the pain and suffering of getting sober. I would rather him just be himself in the basement, drinking. It's too painful. I don't want to see him go through detox. And the child never is cured. The other side of it that could be toxic is masculine dad, who might just say, you know what, son, you dead weight. If you had any sort of self-respect and discipline, you would drop that alcohol like that. And what happens? 2.5 days later, he has a seizure and dies, because that's what happens when a lot of people try to detox from alcohol on their own without the proper support. And then, the mid-ground, I would assume, would be something like mom has every understanding and support to say, hey, we need to get this child some help to get him to rehab, to get him sober. Dad says, hey, let's get him into the program. He can have that support. So ultimately he's cured. There's a start date, there's an end date, there's a timeline. And like everything kind of works out in that regard. But I can also see how, like I said, you take those traits to extreme and you get sort of a toxic compassion or a very toxic cure. And so I think everyone has something special to bear. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you would assume that, the child is having trouble dealing with something in the home, on the path towards addiction. And, parents can send confusing mixed messages, and they're so powerful, they can create no-win situations in the mind of the child that, break a person's spirit. I mean, I think, we do have, we have this incredible gift in the United States of 12-step programs. And, I think they balance these things well. And for family members of addicts, there's Al-Anon. And there are just so many, I don't know if it's hundreds, or probably it's more than 200 meetings a week, something like that, in the greater Boston area of Alcoholics Anonymous alone. I mean, there are just meetings, in hospital chaplain rooms, and church basements, and it's just a constant thing. So many people are, fighting these things. That's a tough situation. I mean, once a person, that's more of an Al-Anon question, because you cannot control the person, even if you created the mess. Your power to uncreate it, is really limited, because that to the person would be another instance of your agency outweighing their agency. And maybe that's what drove them to addiction in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is some power in being able to dose yourself to do, agency or autonomy, and being able to do something that others disapprove of, just to show them that you can. I also think from a medical perspective, I think it's always interesting, alcohol and benzodiazepines, they ultimately innervate GABA receptors in the brain. And what's interesting about that is, the mechanism for healing anxiety, or to at least salve it, is to innervate those GABA receptors. And what's also interesting to me is that when you're fasting and you release ketones, they naturally innervate those GABA receptors. And a quarter of all women in America have anxiety. So you could say, hey, therapy 1 could be alcohol, or therapy 2 could be benzodiazepines, and there's a massive market for those two things. But at the same time, some fasting and famine might go a long way with kind of alleviating that sensation of restlessness as well. And you always wonder too, like, are these people who really are drinking that often, or what are they medicating? I mean, at some point you just have to start thinking of it in that term. Like, okay, this is not just a social pastime where you're sitting down and watching your favorite game and drinking a few beers. This is something that almost seems physiologic at some point.
Yeah, and then somehow, we see that, let's say I'm here in the Ohio Valley right now. If a steel plant, in the old days would shut down, the incidence of alcoholism, spikes. So people experience that loss of agency. They're not sure what to do. A whole host of social. So there's even an economic dimension. Last year, I think in 2023, 100,000 Americans died of fentanyl or heroin, or these kind of things.
Sounds about right.
So,
yeah.
I mean, we are living in a situation now where the crises are so existential. Like you said, this complete collapse of testosterone levels, the hundreds of thousands of people dying from drug overdose, and yet it seems to mostly impact the sort of people who don't go to Ivy League colleges and go on to control the nation's mass media and universities and government. And so our elites seem, so deeply out of touch with really existential threats to their own nation. And
they are surrounded in an echo chamber of people who either somehow don't need those substances because life isn't that way for them, or maybe they're just oblivious to the plight of so many. I mean, I guess the old phrase is, when the rich and famous sneeze, the poor die with pneumonia, something like that.
So it is a thing. And of course, that gap between the elites and the, and flyover country, was big enough to drive a Trump campaign through. Right. And he did. And he drove it right through.
He did.
And of course, his choice of running mate for the second time exemplified that, as a survivor of the, this disembowelment of the economy of flyover country and the resulting drug crisis. I mean, talking about J.D. Vance. And so this was, an important kind of response. But I mean, if I really believe in the potential of Al-Anon and of other, for relatives and other 12-step programs, but I also believe, you have to put the culture back together. And a lot of this does go back to economics, and the way in which there are not a lot of opportunities that seem meaningful to people.
Dr. Tim, let me ask you this question. So, speaking of that idea of culture, I mean, in America, at least for, let's say, the last 200 years, or maybe in particular the last 50 or 60 years, there's been this pride of us not really having a unifying culture, that, you can come here and do whatever you want. You can become whatever you want. ultimate freedom, ultimate liberty. I think to some extent what you're touching on here is that for for the purposes of eras, the era of the Byzantines, the era of the English, and the colonial, to really survive, isn't solidarity almost like a necessary, just
Yeah.
sort of a necessary, I wouldn't even call it evil. I think it's an amazing thing. But in my mind, maybe that really is what America's getting wrong, is that at some point we really just have to kind of agree on who the hell we are, and bring that up to scale so that we can solve fentanyl problems. We can solve diabetes, about 100 million people in the United States, all these various issues through culture.
Yeah, that is, I mean, that's a huge issue. Culture is being generated all the time, and there are local subcultures, and it's work to figure out what they are and where they're going. Yeah, but certainly, I feel like people in power, in any organization, really, whether it's an elementary school or whatever, so much depends on their ability to act justly and selflessly, and to act in ways that Jane Jacobs would say, people want to develop their work, and they want to feel like, not all people, but most people want to take some ownership of their work and feel that they have the power to improve it or make it better. Or if they're not aware of this desire, they can be taught it.
Mm-hmm.
And they also want to feel that some of the rewards of that improvement, accrue to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's, morally destructive that, CEOs, can have pay packages that are so much more expensive, so much more lucrative. And I think it's, there's a lot of things like that where you're just really asking yourself, I mean, you just think of Tom Brady. There's a guy whose whole life was ritual, just, to go because he was my neighbor, a mile away from my house for all those years. And I thought about him a lot, for that, driving by his house and thinking, there's a guy whose life was ritual, to the nth degree. His bedtime, what he drank before bed, what he drank immediately upon awakening, everything, because the chaos of 300-pound linemen, sitting on you and killing you and all that. He's facing chaos, and just the whole chaos of the NFL, and he faced it. And yet, his thing was, he was always willing to sacrifice the salary for the sake of, making space in the team's economics to pay other players. He was not one of these guys who was trying to cash out. So that's something that we have to reintroduce, a kind of feeling of shame, shame to the person at the top who takes everything and doesn't, and right now, I mean, and it's not, right now it's even worse in that, in our school systems, in our healthcare systems, it seems like there's been this massive overgrowth of bureaucracy, and those people are right next to HR. They're making sure they're on the pension plan. They're making sure they're on the, they have the HSA, and they've got, all the benefits that's coming.
Yeah.
And then meanwhile, the nurse who's down there, working part-time and actually holding the blood and guts of this thing together, is not focused on that and is not winning. And so we just need a new generation of leadership that really will, nip that in the bud when it rises.
One of the things that I think is an example of what you speak to, and maybe also is why Tom Brady is not as tempted to fall into that same error. I mean, the guy is in the trenches with his team. So, like, in my mind, that camaraderie where, like, the guy next to you really did help you not get hit and slammed by the 350-pound lineman, etc. Like, that's so raw and that's so real. To bring an example from the ER, it's so raw and so real all the time with the blood and guts and the suffering and the challenges, etc. But my hospital CEO only would come down to the ER maybe 10 minutes a year. At most, he would make a little flyby pass, hand out some sandwiches, and leave. And one time he was famous for saying, when it was really busy and we had no place to even put sick patients in a hallway anywhere. He's like, it's good for business. That was his inspirational words. And in his mind, I mean, the guy never took care of a patient in his life. He has no clue. No healthcare worker in the world would have thought of putting it in those terms. But you got a guy who's not really hired for that jargon, although you think he should be. He's a CEO of a hospital. And so, yeah, there's definitely an incredible disconnect as we come with so many, units and silos and pathways to management for the sake of management versus still remaining a content expert. I mean, that's what I think is so amazing about Elon Musk is that, the guy, I guess, I mean, I'm just basing on what I've read about him, but he seems to be a content expert who's also a manager and is happy going back and forth between those extremes, and it keeps him raw and it keeps him in context.
It's the Steve Jobs would say the same. He says, we thought we were supposed to become a real company, and we hired all these outside professional managers. And he said they were bozos, they couldn't do anything. And finally we realized what you needed was the best creator, the guy or girl who didn't want to be a manager, and just tell them tough because anyone else is going to be worse. And they knew how to pull it off. I think any organization that scales, though, starts to have, friction accumulates in a large organization, and there's always going to be, those disconnects. And it's the job of leadership to kind of go after them, because if they accumulate, they will sink, a whole society will. Roy Rappaport, wrote this book, Ritual and Religion and the Making of Humanity. And he was an atheist or an agnostic at least. But his argument was that, across the spectrum, in every continent, humans had evolved with religion, and religion made us human, and ritual made us human. And one of that Ritual and Religion book is, even bigger than my book. So I haven't read it all, but one of his strong, observations is that when language evolves, it gives us all this power, but it also introduces something totally new, the possibility of the lie. And now lots of people feel like the articulate rule society because they're the best and smoothest liars. And they enervate all the people who actually want to work and produce. But they're the smoothest liars, And for Rappaport, one of the things Ritual does is it connects religion stably with what it's referring to, the sign with the referent, the sign with the thing it's pointing to. And it does that often through blood. And I think, like you just said about Tom Brady, I mean, there's a blood aspect, or in the ER, there's a blood aspect. When you go through things with your colleagues in any organization and the hard times together, and you see that the good guys got rewarded and the bad guys got let go, then that's a blood tie that, makes that organization stronger. And if in the name of niceness, you let go of all that, right, you create a culture where the nominal, the name and the reality get fatally disconnected. And it's total chaos. It's like, an attractive woman who's living with a guy telling you she's having trouble with him. It's a meaningless statement. Are you supposed to, encourage them to stick it out?
Oh, great point. Great point.
So when you have these situations where the rule of blood is not respected, then it's chaos, and the chaos eventually defeats everyone. No one can live in chaos. That's, Mircea Eliade 101. Everybody needs to establish a cosmos so they have some stable frame of reference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know, in the ER, people will ask people, about their health history, and the person next to them, hey, is this friend or family? And I mean, it's like the most predictable response. I'm always looking forward to hear what they say. When you get someone, let's say they're in their 30s, maybe even their 40s, maybe 20s, it's a girl, she comes in with a guy, hey, who is this? They look at each other, they kind of awkwardly pause. This is my fiance, and I mean, they have some kids together, but like they can't even describe to me who the hell they are to each other, and while you might say, oh, well, they know, if you can't really put it into speech, there's something that's really not resonating as true there, or at least there's an awkwardness, and it's almost like they're they're playing like a tea party. Like they're mimicking something, but they're not actually it.
So, so I mean, they're slobs, and I say that as a slob, because I dress like a slob most of the time, and those are the two options. You can dress for success, or you can dress for survival, and the slobs are dressed for survival. So, in a situation where they feel like a commitment we make probably isn't going to last, and not only that, it might entice others to attack it, or the very ambiguity is a defense strategy or against losing the person. Or if I'm really married, then when she leaves, she can take all my so
you're
they're
absolutely
slobs. And I don't mean that I speak as a slob. They're slobs because they're dressing for survival and not for success. And what that tells you is that they're living either personally or in their, at their state, regional, local, or international level in a world that cannot generate cosmos out of chaos anymore.
Well, that's a brilliant point. I mean, I think about this in hyperbole. Like the Tate brothers, Andrew and Tristan Tate. Okay, the most Googled individuals in the world.
Okay.
They have some strengths. I appreciate their brotherhood. One is Orthodox, evidently. The other one's Muslim. Wherever that ends up putting them, I'm not sure. But what's so bizarre to me is that as those guys went through years of being accused by old lovers of rape and assault and whatever else, the reality is that those two gentlemen, as they're being interviewed, who are so anti-marriage, like as they're talking about the value of loyalty and of being private and this connection with the woman, like what they're really speaking to is the benefits of marriage. Like, well, now I know that the next woman I meet, she could be an enemy. And now I know that the next woman I meet, she could eventually accuse me of something. Well, dude, like if you had just married her, like initially, I'm not saying you're supposed to marry any woman that you meet, but let's just say you found someone that that things made sense. Well, those issues of loyalty and question and ambiguity would have been sorted out. Like that's the whole historical point. And so
sure, yeah. And those guys, I mean, they are men of ritual, and that gives their power. It's clear that they work out. It's clear that they have certain rituals around their finances that protect them in that way. And they are men of blood in the sense that at least one of them is a fighter, and they challenge people physically if necessary. So there is a kind of reality to them. But it's very much sort of the longhouse of a degraded post-Christian society, and what's needed from them is some kind of repentance for them to take what's good about themselves and to create something actually healthy for society.
Well, it's just funny though. You can see these people in such a position of glamour and richness and fame, also living in that mentality of survival. I mean, they've been through some highs and lows. They've been in prison, they've been in lockdown. Sure. They are meeting people. How do I respond? Is this going to be misinterpreted? I mean, I'm sure there's a certain nausea to their life that really permeates even the most delicious food or the most high-end car they're driving, etc. Just like anyone who has an argument with their wife at a dinner or something, there's a spirit in the air that just can make the food taste really bland. And I just have to imagine that if one of life's greatest pleasures, which is falling in love and being with the woman that you're supposed to marry, if you're circulating in this strategic survival mode of it just seems to me like a recipe for really bland, a bland sense of flavor to life, even though you're trying to posture that it's not that way.
Right. I mean, I think when you like, are they builders? What are they building? They're building their brand. They're building their bodies. I'm not sure what else. Their finance. What are they building for society? Maybe as a kind of, they sort of basically are gang leaders on a global electronic level. And they have millions of young boys, all over the world who defathered or poorly fathered or, insufficiently fathered, look to them. I would say not even insufficiently fathered, insufficiently uncled. because
Yeah.
you need that other side of things, too. That's just a slightly more dangerous man than your father is kind of allowed to be in the house. Not dangerous, but wild, just drifting or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like in that the famous line in Spy Kids, the kids say to their uncle, "We always knew you were the CIA," and he says, "How?" And they say, "Because you never had a job, you always traveled the world, and you always somehow had money." And he shoots back, "Everybody has an uncle like that." So 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 so, so there's some.
What are you trying to say, Uncle Tim? What are you trying to reveal?
So I no, but even if you're married, I mean, you not only I'm just speaking to you as a man. Not only do you do something wonderful for your kids as their dad, but your nephews and nieces also, you're an additional confirmation of the patriarchy in a way that is not so visibly tamed by their own mother, and that's important for them as they round out their mental cosmos of
Yeah.
male and female capacities, and
They do.
and the kind of world that we're living in, and for young people to feel like they have enough fight in them to learn the old ways and apply them. I mean, it's. I mean, I'm talking too much in a row. You go.
No, this is great. And I think it's funny how you touch on that sort of. It's sort of dad speaking to them without mom kind of mellowing them out. I mean, there's something to that unfiltered perspective that does come across a little bit more wild and a little bit more.
A slightly racier joke, a slightly more threatening, possibility. It's good.
Relatable.
When I was young, I used to think, well, how do people find jobs? And then you get older and you realize the work that needs doing is sort of limitless. And the constraining factor is not that there's not enough work. It's that there's not enough people who can work conscientiously and well. That's the constraining factor in society. It's just human capital. And a lot of people are defeated by the sense that, oh, there won't be opportunities. But in the meantime, the opportunities are dying for you to hold it together, improve yourself, work on yourself, show up, repent, get closer to Christ, pursue the Holy Spirit, and show up for these opportunities, because the whole world is waiting for you, men and women. Yeah.
There's this incredible line in your book that I just want to read out loud, which I thought was just so powerful. See how we riff on this. So in this paragraph, page 29, Shea points in the same direction. He says that what is needed is not cognitive processing, a listener in a hurry to download all your personal data, find a solution, and move on, but a listener who weeps where you can't, a listener who feels your hurt in ways that you can't yet. And even before you get to this, Shea says we need to establish good patterns of self-care. There's one other line that seems related. It says the listeners, and then it goes on to talk about the listeners' benefit of this process. The listeners are healed because in grieving for others, heroic and ideal combat veterans, they learn to grieve for themselves. Just absolutely came off the page to me, because I'm in the business or in the line of work where we're oftentimes trying to give prognosis to a patient who was just diagnosed with cancer, a sense of what this laceration means to their tendon, what this illness means for their ability to go on a trip or to go to a wedding or to be at a ceremony. Like I'm often in that place where I need to not only listen to the patient, but also sometimes to show them how to react. Like it's funny, actually. I've noticed, I'm in a room and I'm trying to tell someone who's a 75-year-old male who's been losing weight without cause, who looks gaunt, who has a pain in his upper belly, his epigastrum, who can't eat, and he's just wondering, is this just a bad season of the year? And no, sir, you have pancreatic cancer, and I'm sorry to tell you, you have an average of 6 months to live, even with the best chemo and radiation. It's over. And you're sort of sitting there trying to help them navigate this news, and they're looking to your body language to figure out, should I be worried? or like I've even told people facts, and they're still looking for my reaction beyond the facts to know if they should be weeping, sad, angry, frustrated. There's some type of mirroring going on. But as we kind of go back to this discussion about war and helping soldiers heal, and showing them how to grieve and how to mourn, and maybe even how to live when they've forgotten how to do that any longer. I just felt that those lines were just so incredibly powerful.
Yeah. So I mean, to go back to something we said earlier, and this will relate, but it take a little bit to get to it. The feeling in the 50s was that, our society was guided by kind of desiccated rationalism, and people wanted something, more organic, or somehow, the way of the heart, and drugs, were part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma. So that choice, the choice for a kind of desiccated rationalism, is sort of like, pride of the intellect, let's say, doesn't need the way of the heart. I'm so smart. I don't need feelings. I don't need people. I don't need, but trauma also produces a disconnect between the mind and the heart, a mind and the feelings. And this is why lots of people just reacting against, let's say, my parents were too square, use language of like, oh, this is part of my healing, is to, reconnect with. They were not trauma victims per se.
Right.
So there's some kind of a confusion there, but you can sort of see why, it happens. Having said that, to make that mind and the heart connection is not trivial. And it's like the center of Orthodox Christian life is hesychastic prayer, is the Jesus prayer, which is not only prayer for the life of the world, but it's prayer for the possibility of human integration. That my nous can be placed in my heart, focused on the name of Christ, and that this will produce a thoroughgoing integration of all my powers, physical, emotional, spiritual, intellectual. I'm really, for the first time, I'm not divided against myself, and I'm not fighting against myself. And for the first time, I am not carrying combat and chaos to others. But now that I have achieved this integration, or, been graced with it by God's grace through this prayer and through God's mercy, I am a force for peace and for cosmos for others. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that, it's so we have this, and I think fasting is a big part of that. I think fasting is a big part of reestablishing the mind-heart connection. It is integral. It's almost, it's unheard of in the history of the church for the one to happen without the other. I mean, certainly we don't do the fasting without the other thing just because we want to, I mean, in the, let's say in the monastic life, it's not like they're interested in health outcomes, sure, but
Correct.
they're after something else, right? So you're putting these things together, and you're becoming the kind of person. It's just not, it's not trivial. You don't know, does this guy need? Here's where I was initially going with this. To a traumatized person, now their pain is not showing up. So their mirror neurons, seeing you cry for them, gives them the possibility of crying for themselves. And now the mind-body connection is reestablished.
I mean, it's a powerful thing. Speaking about the idea of liturgy and communion, I mean, in that whole idea that somehow we mirror each other's behaviors. I can see things because you have seen them. I use your eyes so that I can see what you've discovered that I was unable to filter or select for prior, and how that happens so naturally through the therapeutic thought. It's not even like thing. It's not even. It's almost like we're talking about it as we're just as we're appreciating this process. But I think as you've written in your book, and you've reached some stories about this interplay too. I think particular being in the hospital actually with a lady once in Greece that was taking care of you, but she didn't have to go through step 1 through 5 to get to that point. She just spoke naturally as a healthcare provider, as a soul, as a human being, as a person that's part of our of humanity. And but also in the right balance of things. I mean, of course,
Yeah.
there's discussions about humanity getting the right balance, but it seems so natural. It seems so natural what you're pointing on and what you're highlighting. But at the same time, such a rare thing to be utilized.
And liberal arts education used to be part of this mind-heart connection. It was kind of a kind of hesychasm for the West, in the sense that you would see the limits of intellect in the characters of a novel. You would see something in your heart would awaken through the study of art or philosophy. And what has happened over the last so many decades is that the study of the liberal arts has been captured by an approach to goodness rather than beauty, rather than feeling and aesthetics, where the history of art is the history of oppression, and it's the oppression of and so again, you're constantly teaching people to distrust their own spiritual reaction. Instead of people cleansing their hearts, they're just getting stuffed with resentment and desire for revenge. And it's all kind of confused. It's intellectually kind of weak too. It doesn't really, there's no real basis, in history or anything. It's just a lot of nonsense. And
what a distortion! What an absolute distortion of the prime movers of what makes us who we are. If we get truth, beauty, and goodness wrong, we're not even talking about an imbalance. We're talking about a complete distortion of what that goodness should be. Now, this is not Michelangelo's Pietà, where you should feel mourning and a sense of calmness and sorrow, but this is oppression, and the block that was used here was on the backs of slaves, and the Italians at the time were oppressing people around them, and never mind the corruption within the papal seat. I mean, anyway, and just I can just imagine all the things that they would bring up, so that when I go to Venice or I go to Rome and try to see these things, somehow I would feel like I'd be participating in some type of some type of colonialism or something. Just crazy. But
well, Christmas time is coming now.
Right.
Here we are, and certainly this is a time for repentance, and somehow
well, again, it's how people have, as you said, sort of psyoped these cultural norms that really have sustained us and have given us a sense of respite. I mean, what we're really saying here psychologically, to take on a Jordan Peterson perspective, which again, I always feel like he misses the spiritual underpinning, but he'll get there eventually. I think he's getting closer and closer to Eureka moment. But, psychologically, if we could just say that there was this technique and system called religion, and specifically Orthodox Christianity, that was allowed to support and build up its people and to bring reconciliation and forgiveness and mercy and justice to the world, and particularly highlighted over Christmas, like, why the hell would we ever want to get rid of that? Like, that's the most confusing thing to me. It's like, we don't want to have standards in the 21st century, particularly in America, but like, who doesn't want to have a mom and a dad? Who doesn't want to have siblings? Who doesn't want to have a career? Who doesn't want to make money? Like, all these things are components of a healthy life. Why are we so anti-water? You always feel like saying, "Oh, yeah, I'm just anti-water." It's a hydrogen and oxygen. There's floods all over the world. Let's get rid of it. And it's like, no, you need it.
I mean, it's Christ that people have to, the person. And I think Jordan Peterson, is doing so much good for so many people. The issue is that, according to Christianity itself, it is not Christianity that's the answer, right? It's God. It's
right.
It's right. So the danger for an intellectual entering this space, is that they want a kind of civic religion. They want, all the trappings, and it's so in the ethics of beauty, I contrast the truth first way with the beauty first way. It's that we're meant to follow this beauty first path, and the sequence is beauty, goodness, truth. I mean, I'm not upset with my. I mean, I'm comfortable with that phrasing of it. But I think what we really have in the world is not really a concern with truth or beauty. There's just kind of an enraged morality.
Hmm.
And morality really is the sphere of politics, because it's in politics that we decide, what to prescribe, what to encourage, what to forbid, what to declare a war on poverty, because they're all moral questions. A war on cancer or whatever, they're all moral questions, and this kind of morality only, world that we've entered into in wokeism, where truth doesn't matter, like science is expendable, beauty is completely expendable. I mean, the horrible things we're doing to children, and all that matters is morality. And we have this Puritan background in New England that kind of ruled the North, and it did good things. Got rid of slavery, and it did a lot of good things morally. But as a moralistic, Puritan, disapproving, witch hunting kind of movement, it lacks well-roundedness, and it's just been jumping the shark lately, and it's kind of day seems to be done, and people want a more balanced approach. They want morality, they want a public morality, and they should, but they need to calm themselves down and see how sacred truth is and how sacred beauty is. Goodness cannot run very far on its own. None of the three transcendentals can. They need each other.
It reminds me of the confusion between a tool and its ends. It's like you take health, health is a tool towards an ends, and it needs to be aligned towards the greatest good. But if you take it to its extreme, you become a bodybuilder that not only, dies at 50, but he probably never got married, couldn't have children because he's sterilized, ignored X, Y, and Z things so he could pursue things in hyperbole. Maybe in the other extreme, you get so lean, you become an anorexic. Like these things that are tools to health, to something, become the purpose of why they exist. And I think about how you're speaking about morality. Like in some ways, it seems so strange. Like, well, isn't morality God, and aren't the virtues God? But it's like energies of God, but those virtues have to be aligned towards something, aimed towards something. And I think if you pursue these tools as an end, if you pursue data for the sake of data, or knowledge for the sake of knowledge, and not for a reason to utilize that data and knowledge, you can get really lost. In fact, I was thinking about the Garden of Eden, and I was thinking to myself, the first sin, of course, was one of fasting. They broke the fast. But another way of looking at it is, it was Adam and Eve partaking of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil for no purpose whatsoever. Like it was literally just to pursue knowledge, and like it had no trajectory, it had no aim, and so in my mind, like when we talk about the data age, which almost takes that scenario to hyperbole, where we could always need more information, right, or always need more data points on a line. Without that line being pointed towards something, it just becomes an extraordinary distraction. It can be really distorted. But in some weird way, and I take it to another point, it's so bizarre to me. It's like we get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and like the one commandment or the one promise God makes, you could say it's a curse or maybe a tool for salvation. But Adam, you're going to work, and by the way, Eve, you're going to have children in pain. Like women don't want to have kids, and men are just sick of working, and we're totally obsessed with the pursuit of knowledge. Like, to me, that's like the ultimate trifecta that something is really wrong with society, and so speaking to your point about how we can misinterpret morality and the tools as a goal, you can get the wrong sequence.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, but we're back. We're back where we started. We're back in the garden the moment after we fell, or the moment we're still trying to fall.
Yeah,
we're not. Yeah, we're actually reaching for the thing that will bring the fall.
With rockets, we're falling. I mean, it's sort of saying as a joke, but yeah,
no. I mean, that is a question, because economic life is so dependent on development. I mean, it's focused on this continual adaptation of the new, but we see now where that's going. I mean, it's going to a world of warfare, of drones and things that we just cannot imagine
Yeah.
when someday some government somewhere, creates 10 drones for every American, with our face and our name and our smell and all the rest in there, and just releases them to kill us all.
And 5,000 a pop, evidently. I've heard that number, that a drone, like a military grade drone, is only like several $1,000s. I mean, it just blows my mind. But anyway, I mean, in other words,
yes.
possibility.
So economics really depends on innovation and the new, but the new seems to be pushing in directions that will be hard to imagine, and hopefully will be compatible with human life, and not with some kind of post-humanity of it's just everyone is imprisoned in. Well, the apocalypse described a world in which people wish they could die and they can't. And somehow the church is more important than ever. I would say monasticism is more important than ever. Prayer, family, but repentance towards in the person of Jesus Christ. It's a little. We'll see what happens. If we live long enough.
It is sort of a wild idea. And again, I go back to this because one of my areas of research is in Orthodox Christian fasting, and I'm always amazed to see how that practice, which is prescribed for always, is so truly healing to both soul and body. And how, while we're only discovering its mechanisms now, like those mechanisms still existed 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, even longer. When we say you have to have faith to practice X, Y, and Z, and to go to church and do this and do that, like it's such a sad thing that we have to kind of leave the safeguards of that that way of life to realize how essential it was. I mean, all of these things go together, right? They're talking about how in France right now, their government's in a just giant state of peril. But like, what did France do last summer? They highlighted they redid the Last Supper in some bizarre fashion with weirdos, being actors, and it all goes together. It's like the same secular humanistic society that's going to insult Jesus Christ and God himself. It's the same one that's going to move themselves into total chaos. And so it will happen to us if we are not, going to at least be able to know common sense things like what's a woman and what's a man, what's left and what's right, what's north and what's south, what's 1 + 1. Like, if we can't agree on the basic rationalities of life, even if there are exceptions, very rare circumstances, like on the order of, I think, 1 in 150,000, when we want to talk about hermaphrodites and whatever, there are just some unfortunate situations for people, but those deserve some kindness and some understanding. But it's not 1 in 200. It's 1 in 150,000. Give them all $2 million a piece, help them out, whatever they want to do. But I'm just saying is, it's just unfortunate that we have to, get rid of all of our medicine and our cures and our way of life that make us happy, healthy, well, meaningful, to just feel emptiness, to know that we need to now stop, slapping, as one philosopher said, you have to sit in Christ's lap, to slap him in the face to prove he doesn't exist. There was some debate that Christopher Hitchens had with a gentleman, and he's like, oh, you're just constantly blasting Jesus, and you're kind of like sitting in his lap and slapping him and just complaining, and that's your evidence that he doesn't exist. But he does exist, and many of these things that are given to us are salves. And it's amazing, as you highlight this in this the book of the Ethics of Beauty, and specifically chapter 1 with war, how, like, why would we ever want to get rid of this ceremony of initiating war, preparing soldiers' souls for warfare, to bring them back and reintegrate them into society? Like, what's wrong with all of that? And it's a sad thing that we have to kind of go through this as if we're the first generation in the humanity to discover these concepts.
Well, societies go through dark ages. I mean, they do, and some of them never come out. And Jane Jacobs made the point that a dark age is distinguished by mass forgetting. So and the loss of the ability to write, the death of cities. So we see some of these things, and so somehow our civilization, it probably beginning about World War I, North American and Western European civilizations, started really dipping their toes into a kind of dark age, intensified by World War II. The complete collapse of their birth rates now, they may not recover from this dark age. It just could be that they just, are eclipsed. So these things happen, and Rod Dreher wrote a good book about the Benedict option, about one way to react when these dark ages onset, to create at least pockets of intense preservation of the memory, which is what helped Western Europe, that the monasteries hung in there.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
So these things definitely do happen. I think, though, you mentioned atheism, and I've been thinking, lately, that's really funny, because atheism is on the cutting edge of like 1750. I mean, it's so out of date.
Uh-huh.
Whereas if you think about, what is the intellectual center of the human race for the last 50 years? Without a doubt, and increasingly, over the last 20 or 30 years, it's Silicon Valley. Everything else is nothing compared to not only the technological change, but the social impact, the spiritual impact, and then their experimentations with either optimal human performance or human longevity, things like this. And what do they think about this atheism question? The complete opposite. They're worried that we might be trapped in a matrix of someone else's creation. The total opposite of atheism. The complete opposite. That there's some kind of something, so.
Yeah, they talk about simulation theory. I've heard a podcast or two on this topic, and it seems bizarre, actually, how it's like religion, just with different terms. There's a game, there's friction, there's goals. I mean, in a certain way, like, I could talk about the story between good and evil and theosis and practices and tools to purify myself. They see it as, oh, I'm an avatar, and my soul, my something is in another dimension, and I'm participating in this way, and we're trying to figure it out. I don't know. It just, in some ways, when I heard this guy talk about his simulation theory, it just sounded to me like he was basically saying religion, but using like almost digital game theory terms, in place of those terms.
Yes, and their fear that they're imprisoned in some God-created world. Of course, that God might just be a 15-year-old kid in some other dimension of history, who's writing the program that we're all, but that God does not love them, and that has given them no substantial existence, and ultimately no meaning to what they're doing. We're just toys. And
could you imagine being in a position in Silicon Valley where you have such brain power and computer power, and as you described, talking about the metaverse that Facebook's going to create, and you might start to realize, like, oh my God, like, I could create a parallel world where there's characters, and they can buy real estate, and they can fall in love, and they can procreate. Like, I can see why they would make a leap to be like, wait, if we can create this on our own, and we do live in the universe, then there must be a creator. I'm doing it right now digitally.
Yeah, I mean, I you're more interested in this than I am. I just think it's so funny that these British atheists, Collins, or no, not whatever the names were, Hitchens and the other, that they thought they were so on the cutting edge of being sharp because they were anti-religion, and in reality, they're like children playing on the seashore, because over here are the adults in Silicon Valley who are doing all the really hard work of thinking about and creating this world that we're living in. And they're on the total opposite end of the spectrum of that question. There almost definitely is a God, and we're trapped in his world, and there's no escaping it. So I just want to point out that those guys are jokers. They're jokers, those British atheists. I mean, just like, not even worth the discussion almost. Like, okay, come on. What are you talking about? Where did all this order come from?
Just to maybe wrap up with one last topic, if you just have a few more minutes.
Sure.
You were mentioning about how societies can kind of forget themselves. Things are lost to oblivion.
Sure.
I just came back from Peru, and I walked 26 miles on the Inca Trail. And I saw, I mean, you know, we're all Greeks and we're so proud of our heritage, and we're amazed at the Parthenon and the Acropolis. But I saw things for 26 miles in that wilderness that rivaled the scale and complexity of any, you know, Greek architecture or art I've
Hmm.
ever seen. I mean, maybe not as intricate, but in terms of just
Hmm.
staircases that you would think, like, someone said to themselves, you know what, I want this staircase wrapped in this mountain that's several thousand feet high from an 11,000-foot base off the sea level. I want to have this beautiful staircase that wraps up as if I'm going to my attic. Like you could see the care that these people put into evidently 20,000 kilometers of stairs throughout the Andes Mountains, and the terraces, and the fact that these mountains weren't just mountains to be crossed, but natural skyscrapers to create into homes. And I've never seen anything like it. But there's a technology there of brick laying, of mortarless, you know, layers and stacks of bricks. And I had a Italian American friend, I think you know him, Joe Mazzella, who was on the trip with me, and he was just standing in front of these things trying to figure it out. Like, he does construction for a living. It just was so mind blowing. This a 200-ton stone that has smooth edges and is polygonal on 15 sides and is somehow stacked another one on top. And you could see that the Aztecs, although they were supposed to have created these things, the architecture that they started seemed to be on top of an older technology. Like, it's almost as if they showed up to the Andes however many thousands of years later, hundreds of years later, and we're like, oh, well, there's these stones here. We don't know how to recreate that, but let's build ones that we know with mortar, with you know, some technology, but it wasn't what was. Anyway, there's this guy, Graham Hancock, who keeps talking about this civilization that was annihilated from a flood, probably from 12,000 years ago. And I know the timeline doesn't quite match up with the Judeo-Christian story in terms of year for year, but it essentially speaks to a forgotten civilization, a forgotten technology that you would think, who would ever want to forget how to do that? And so I just see real life examples, I guess, historically, that it just seems so real to me, because I walked it and, you know, fell on a stone or two and scraped my knee, you know, on it, just to say that
It's real. Yes, civilizations, you know, that they're faced with death, and they don't always, you know, avoid it.
yeah,
And
yeah.
this mass forgetting and all these things, and just, you know, how people are, we all can get so deceived, and it's hard to know how to rebuild, you know, how to rebuild if you don't, you know, if you don't. So how did J.D. Vance do it? Like, how did he come from a situation where his parents were out of the picture? It was his
I would love to
grandmother
know
that
that.
was,
Love to know that. I don't know.
but partly there was this escape valve of the Marine Corps, right? And there was the possibility of an organization that has not forgotten what it is,
Hmm.
and has preserved, you know, its history and its memory. And part of that memory is knowing how to transform a willing person into this other capacity. And then he, you know, he went on to Ohio State, and there was enough there, you know, Ohio State University, to study and all that. And then went to Yale Law School. There was enough there. And he's really not just a, you know, an adroit politician, but he's a, you know, a good political philosopher. And it's always exciting. I mean, my favorite thing to do, you know, is to discover things that are being forgotten. It's the nicest thing, you know, and it's the greatest joy. It's the greatest joy, really.
Well, I think it's an amazing thing you highlight about how the antidote to chaos is this ritual, and the more chaos, the more ritual, and how someone like J.D. Vance, who could go from a, you know, for lack of a better term, sort of a very rough white, you know, white trash, you know, area. I mean, that's how he describes it. You know, to joining something that has a lot of structure, a lot of ritual, a lot of respect, and working himself up the ranks, to get somewhere, you know, that no one would expect him. No one expects him to become vice president from that. But certainly in his story and hyperbole, he he really showed us how far you can go with ritual. And he's a young guy. I mean, I think he's my age. I think he's 30, 39, 40, at this point. So he's obviously doing really well for himself. Uncle Tim, Dr. Tim, I really appreciate you giving me your time.
That's great.
I think it's incredible that we can dive so deeply into a chapter and at the same time explore, and as they call it, the Trump weave, going left, going right, and coming back to center eventually. But the chapter itself speaks to some very deep principles that are applicable in many, many different arenas. And there's something there that's very encouraging, because we all, I think, go in our lives through elements of the berserk, and we can lose faith and lose our path. And life is a war, and our jobs are a war, and we can see how things scale in this age better than ever before through technology and through just size of things. And these principles are, I think, just so important to explore and to grasp and to integrate. And especially in the ER, I thank you for helping me better understand the value in being able to show people how to mourn and how to show grief, and also to better appreciate that they might be looking at me to mirror how they're supposed to feel and what they're supposed to do next. And I never really appreciated just how obvious that of course must be until you put it on a piece of paper. And I could just, wow, that just was so powerful to me. Just one of the many things that came out from that first chapter.
Thank you. And thank you. We're certainly grateful for, I mean, what's the word they used during COVID? The frontline providers? Is that what the term?
Frontline heroes. Yeah, frontline heroes. I think
there are many front lines, in the Jane Jacobs said that the city is a drama of civilization versus barbarism, and the barbarians are the young, and they don't know anything, and they can't talk, and but there are many, the thin blue line. There's just anyone, teachers, people loving their families. Anytime that we love each other is especially if it's with reference to Christ, is really a huge chaos dampener and a massive cosmos generator. And we're never going to run out of chaos, so don't worry, people, that it's going to be a boring old 1950s world or something.
Right,
the chaos is going to keep coming.
And
the fun in life is getting better and better at turning that into cosmos, and being able to say thank you for the hard times, and thank you for the setbacks, and thank you for the failures, and thank you for the pains, and the and the diseases too, because that thank you is such a powerful, it's literally a Eucharistic, that's what Eucharisto means, is thank you. And that thank you in the face of adversity is an incredible mini liturgy that turns chaos into cosmos. So thanks for having me on.